The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like ice. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake. You need to move to economy." Irene Hill looked up from her boarding pass, confusion flickering across her face. Around her, first-class passengers whispered and stared, their judgment already written in their expressions. She was young, she was a woman, and to them, she clearly didn't belong. But what none of them knew, what the sneering businessman in Tua couldn't possibly imagine, was that the quiet young woman being escorted down the aisle had just returned from leading one of the most dangerous operations in Naval Special Forces history. And in exactly 10 minutes, 6 Navy SEALs would board this plane and change everything. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Irene Hill had learned to make herself small. At 27, she'd perfected the art of occupying minimal space, of softening her voice, of dimming the intensity that burned behind her gray eyes. It was a survival skill she'd developed over 9 years of military service, where being a woman in special operations meant constantly calibrating how much of yourself to reveal and how much to hide. The Frankfurt Airport bustled with its usual chaos that Tuesday morning. Travelers rushed past with rolling suitcases, their faces buried in phones, oblivious to everything except their departure gates and connecting flights. Irene stood at the check-in counter for Atlantic Airways Flight 247 to Washington, D.C., her military duffel bag worn but meticulously maintained, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like lead. She'd been awake for 36 hours. The mission in the Baltic had taken longer than anticipated, and the debriefing had stretched through the night. Her commanding officer had insisted she take the first available flight home, had personally arranged for her first-class ticket as recognition for what she'd accomplished. But looking at the ticket now, Irene felt only the familiar weight of not quite belonging. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile, barely glanced at Irene's passport before printing her boarding pass. "First class, seat 3B, she announced, her tone carrying just a hint of surprise as she looked from the ticket to Irene's casual attire, jeans, a plain gray sweater, and worn sneakers. "Thank you," Irene replied quietly, taking the boarding pass and moving toward security. The airport was a blur of duty-free shops and overpriced coffee stands. Irene found a quiet corner near her gate and pulled out her phone. 3 missed calls from her mother in Lyon, 2 text messages from her younger brother asking when she'd be home, and 1 encrypted message from her unit that she'd read and deleted immediately. The message had been brief: "Operation successful. All personnel accounted for. Well done, Commander." Commander. The rank still felt surreal, even after 2 years. At 25, she'd been the youngest person and the first woman to achieve that designation in her unit. The promotion had come with its own set of challenges, chief among them the constant need to prove that she'd earned it through merit rather than some misguided attempt at diversity. Irene closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, something she rarely permitted. The mission in the Baltic had been her design, her strategy. For 6 months, she'd analyzed intelligence reports, studied weather patterns, and coordinated with 3 different Allied forces. The operation had required precision timing, absolute silence, and the kind of creative problem-solving that traditional military doctrine didn't teach. They'd extracted a defector from a hostile situation with 0 casualties and 0 detection. It was the kind of success that would be classified for decades, that would never appear on her official record, that no one outside her immediate chain of command would ever know about. And that was exactly how it needed to be. Now boarding first class and our premium members for Flight 247 to Washington, D.C., the gate agent announced over the intercom. Irene gathered her belongings and joined the small queue of first-class passengers. Ahead of her stood a businessman in an expensive suit, his leather briefcase probably worth more than her monthly salary. Behind her, an elderly couple discussed their grandchildren in hushed, excited tones. No one made eye contact with her. No one acknowledged her presence. This was normal. This was expected. Irene had spent years being invisible, and she'd convinced herself that she preferred it this way. The jetway was narrow and sterile, smelling of recycled air and industrial cleaner. Irene's footsteps were silent against the carpeted floor as she approached the aircraft. The flight attendants stood at the entrance, their smiles bright and professional as they welcomed passengers aboard. "Good morning, welcome to Atlantic Airways," the first attendant said, her name tag identifying her as Patricia. She was perhaps 40, with auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of each passenger in a single glance. Irene handed over her boarding pass. "Good morning." Patricia's smile faltered almost imperceptibly as she scanned the ticket. Her eyes moved from the boarding pass to Irene's face, then down to her casual clothing and worn duffel bag. "Seat 3B, she confirmed, but her tone had shifted slightly, carrying a question mark that hadn't been there moments before. The first-class cabin was a study in luxury that felt alien to Irene. Leather seats the color of cream, each one wider than her military bunk. Small tables with real wood grain. Ambient lighting that promised comfort and exclusivity. She found her seat and began stowing her bag in the overhead compartment, acutely aware of the eyes tracking her movements. "Excuse me, miss." Patricia appeared at her elbow, her voice low and concerned. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." Irene retrieved it from her pocket and handed it over, confusion beginning to creep in at the edges of her exhaustion. "Is something wrong?" Patricia studied the boarding pass with unnecessary intensity, then glanced at a tablet she was carrying. "Just one moment, please. I need to verify something with the gate." Around them, other passengers settled into their seats. The businessman in two-way had already ordered a whiskey, despite the fact that it was barely 9 in the morning. Across the aisle, a woman in designer clothes was arranging shopping bags in the overhead bin with the careful precision of someone handling precious cargo. Irene stood in the aisle, her duffel bag still half in, half out of the overhead compartment, while Patricia whispered urgently into a phone near the galley. The flight attendant's body language spoke volumes: tight shoulders, furrowed brow, frequent glances in Irene's direction. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Other passengers began boarding, forced to navigate around Irene's suspended state of uncertainty. She caught fragments of their whispers. "Why is she just standing there? Probably some issue with her ticket. First class isn't what it used to be." Irene's face remained neutral, but inside, a familiar knot of tension was forming. She'd faced armed hostiles in the dark. She'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for her entire team. But standing in an airplane aisle while strangers judged her belonging felt like a different kind of combat, one where the rules were unwritten and the victories were never acknowledged. Patricia returned, her professional smile now edged with something harder. Behind her was another crew member, a senior flight attendant whose name tag read Gerald. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing difficult situations. "Miss," Gerald began, his tone carefully neutral, "there appears to be some confusion about your seat assignment." Irene's exhaustion made everything feel slightly unreal, as if she were watching this scene unfold from outside her own body. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "This is the seat on my boarding pass." Gerald smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I can see that. However, we've had a report that this ticket may have been issued in error. First-class seats are typically reserved for our premium members and those who've purchased upgraded tickets. My commanding officer arranged this ticket," Irene explained, keeping her voice level despite the heat rising in her chest. "There's no error." "I'm sure there's a simple explanation," Patricia interjected, her tone suggesting she believed no such thing. "But until we can verify the purchase, we're going to need to ask you to take a seat in economy. We have several available." The businessman in Tua was watching now, his whiskey forgotten. The woman with the designer bags had paused her careful arrangements to observe. Even the elderly couple from the gate had turned their attention to the developing situation. Irene could feel the weight of their collective judgment, the unspoken consensus forming in real time: she didn't belong here. "The ticket was paid for through official military channels," Irene said, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel creeping in. "I can provide verification if necessary." Gerald's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Miss, we're trying to be accommodating here. The flight is fully booked, and we need to get underway. If you'll just take a seat in economy, we can sort out the details once we're airborne. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed up as a courtesy. Irene looked at the boarding pass in her hand, at the clearly printed seat assignment, at the confirmation number that matched their system. She thought about the last 36 hours, about the mission that had required every ounce of her training and intelligence. She thought about the 6 members of her team who would be boarding this flight in the next few minutes, delayed by a final security briefing she'd been excused from because of her early flight time. And she thought about all the times she'd made herself small, all the times she'd swallowed her anger, all the times she'd accepted less than she deserved because fighting was exhausting and the system was rigged, and sometimes survival meant knowing when to retreat. "Fine," she said finally, reaching for her duffel bag. "Which seat?" The relief on Patricia's face was palpable. 36D, down the aisle, all the way to the back. Irene shouldered her bag and began the long walk through the aircraft. Past business class, where passengers glanced up briefly before returning to their laptops and tablets. Past premium economy, where the seats were slightly wider but the judgment in people's eyes was the same. All the way to economy, where the seats were narrow and the overhead bins were already packed with the luggage of budget travelers who'd boarded earlier. Seat 36D was a middle seat between a teenager buried in his phone and a middle-aged man whose shoulders spilled well into her space. Irene wedged herself in, her duffel bag at her feet because the overhead bin was full. The seat felt like a cage after the spaciousness of first class, but more than the physical discomfort, it was the principle that burned. She'd been ejected not because her ticket was invalid, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she didn't look like she belonged. Because she was young, because she was a woman, because her clothing was casual and her bag was worn, and nothing about her screamed wealth or status or the kind of privilege that first class typically represented. The teenager next to her was playing a video game, the tinny sounds of explosions leaking from his inadequate earbuds. The man on her other side had fallen asleep before takeoff, his head already lolling toward her shoulder. Irene closed her eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had served her through countless high-pressure situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're still waiting for a few passengers, and then we'll begin our safety demonstration," the captain announced over the intercom. "Thank you for your patience." Through her closed eyes, Irene heard the continued boarding process. Footsteps in the aisle, the rumble of rolling luggage, the overhead bins slamming shut. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't want to see the curious looks, didn't want to acknowledge the humiliation that was still fresh and raw. But then she heard voices that made her entire body tense. "First class starts here, gentlemen," Patricia's voice carried down the aisle. "Let me help you with your bags." "Appreciated," came a deep voice that Irene recognized immediately. Lieutenant James Torres, her second in command. "Flight got delayed at security. Routine screening took longer than expected." "No problem at all," Patricia replied, her tone warm and accommodating in a way it had never been with Irene. "Welcome aboard." Irene opened her eyes and stared at the seat back in front of her. Her team was boarding. The 6 Navy SEALs she'd led through one of the most dangerous operations of their careers were walking onto this plane, taking their seats in first class, seats that had been arranged for the entire team as recognition for their successful mission. Seats that included hers. She could hear them now, their voices carrying through the cabin as they settled in. Torres making a joke about the legroom. Petty Officer Second Class David Chen commenting on the free drinks. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Richard Bennett, the oldest member of the team at 42, grateful to be stretching out after the cramped transport from the mission site. And then she heard the question that changed everything. "Hey, where's Commander Hill?" That was Torres, his voice suddenly concerned. She was supposed to be on this flight. Her seat should be right here, 3B. Irene's heart began to pound. She should stand up. She should make her way forward. She should explain what happened and let them handle it. But the exhaustion, the humiliation, and the bone-deep weariness of always having to fight kept her frozen in her seat. "Commander Hill?" Patricia's voice carried confusion. I'm sorry, I don't have anyone by that name in first class. That's not possible, Torres insisted. We're all on the same orders. Same unit, same mission, same booking. There should be 7 of us total. Let me check the manifest, Patricia replied. Irene could hear the rustling of papers, the tap of fingers on a tablet. The teenager next to her had finally noticed something was happening, pausing his game to look toward the front of the plane with mild curiosity. I do show 7 tickets purchased together, Patricia admitted slowly. But we only have 6 passengers currently in first class. The 7th ticket was, there was an issue with verification. That passenger was reseated in economy. The silence that followed was deafening. Reseated? Torres's voice had gone cold. What kind of issue? There was some confusion about whether the ticket had been properly purchased. Gerald's voice joined the conversation now, carefully professional. We needed to verify the transaction before allowing. The scissors gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Instructor Volkov grabbed a fistful of Irene Hill's dark hair. The entire training hall fell silent. This was meant to be her ultimate humiliation, the final proof that she didn't belong in the European Intelligence Academy. But as the first locks fell to the floor, something impossible appeared on the newly exposed skin of her neck, a marking that shouldn't exist, written in ink that only appeared under specific conditions. Volkov's hand froze mid-cut. The girl he'd been trying to break for 6 months, the one he'd called weak and emotional, the one he dismissed as the Academy's biggest mistake, was standing there with the identification mark of Phantom, the legendary operative everyone thought was a myth. This is the story of how one act of cruelty revealed the truth that would change everything. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the European Intelligence Academy in Prague as Irene Hill completed her 200th push-up. Her arms trembled, sweat dripped from her forehead onto the cold stone beneath her, but she didn't stop. Around her, the other recruits had finished their morning physical training 30 minutes ago and were already heading to breakfast. But Irene wasn't allowed to stop. Not yet. 201, she counted through gritted teeth. 202. Instructor Volkov stood 10 feet away, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his expression one of cold satisfaction. He'd been watching her for the past hour, occasionally checking his watch, making notes in his ever-present black notebook. At 47, Volkov was a legend at the Academy, a former field operative who'd served in operations across 3 continents. His approval could make a career. His disapproval could end one before it started. 215, Irene gasped, her form beginning to deteriorate. Stop. Volkov's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Irene collapsed onto the stone, her chest heaving, her entire body screaming. She'd been at the Academy for 6 months, and every single day had been a battle. Not against the curriculum, not against the physical demands, but against the systematic dismissal of her capabilities by the man who now stood over her like a judge pronouncing sentence. On your feet, Hill. Irene pushed herself up, swaying slightly as blood rushed from her head. She was 23 years old, stood 5'4", and weighed barely 50 kilograms. Everything about her appearance suggested fragility, delicate features, large dark eyes that seemed perpetually on the verge of tears, and a slender frame that looked like it might snap under pressure. In an institution designed to forge spies and operatives capable of withstanding torture and infiltrating hostile territories, Irene Hill looked like someone who'd wandered in by mistake. Do you know why I kept you out here, Hill? Volkov asked, circling her slowly. No, sir. Because you're weak. He said the word with clinical precision, as if diagnosing a medical condition. Physically weak, emotionally weak, mentally weak. You cry during interrogation resistance training. You hesitate during combat simulations. You form emotional attachments to your training partners instead of viewing them as assets to be utilized. Irene said nothing. She'd learned that arguing only made things worse. The European Intelligence Academy accepts 20 recruits per year from a pool of over 5,000 applicants, Volkov continued. Do you know how many recruits we've dismissed in the past 5 years for emotional instability? No, sir. 7. And do you know what all 7 had in common? He stopped directly in front of her, his ice blue eyes boring into hers. They all reminded me of you. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Irene had known since her first week that Volkov considered her a mistake, an administrative error that had somehow slipped through the rigorous selection process. But hearing it stated so baldly, so publicly, brought a familiar burning sensation to her eyes. Don't you dare, Volkov said softly, noticing the moisture gathering. Don't you dare cry in front of me again. Irene blinked rapidly, forcing the tears back through sheer willpower. This was her greatest weakness and her most hated trait. She felt everything too intensely: fear, anger, frustration, compassion. In a profession that required emotional control and calculated detachment, her inability to separate feeling from function marked her as fundamentally unsuited for intelligence work. Report to hand-to-hand combat training, Volkov said, turning away. Try not to embarrass yourself more than usual. Where is she? This was a new voice, deeper and carrying the unmistakable authority of command. Lieutenant Commander William Foster, the liaison who'd coordinated with Irene's team during the mission. He'd been assigned to fly back with them to handle the initial stateside debriefing. Sir, I'm sure we can sort this out once we're... I asked you a question, and I expect an answer. Foster's voice cut through the diplomatic deflection like a knife. Where is Commander Irene Hill? The entire plane had gone quiet now. Even the passengers who'd been absorbed in their devices were paying attention. Irene sat frozen, knowing what was coming, knowing that in moments her anonymity would be shattered. She's in economy, sir, Patricia admitted, her earlier confidence beginning to crack. Seat 36D. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The sound of boots on the aircraft floor was unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate, moving with military precision down the aisle. Irene kept her eyes closed, but she could track their progress by sound alone. 6 sets of footsteps, moving in unison, stopping conversations and drawing stares as they made their way through business class, through premium economy, all the way to the back where she sat wedged between strangers. Commander. Irene opened her eyes to find Torres standing in the aisle, his face a mixture of confusion and barely contained anger. Behind him, the rest of her team had formed up, their presence transforming the cramped economy section into something else entirely. These were men who'd followed her into hostile territory, who'd trusted her judgment when the stakes were life and death, who knew exactly what she was capable of. Chin was there, his compact frame deceptively powerful. Bennett, with his graying temples and steady eyes that had seen 20 years of combat. Foster stood at the back, his jaw set in a way that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. And flanking them were petty officers Ryan Walsh and Thomas Crawford, both towering over 6 feet and built like they'd been carved from granite. Sir, Torres said, his voice carrying through the now silent cabin, can you explain why you're sitting in 36D when your assigned seat is 3B? The teenager next to Irene had gone completely still, his video game forgotten. The man on her other side had woken up and was now pressed against the window, trying to make himself as small as possible. Irene met Torres's eyes and saw something there that made her throat tighten. Respect. Unwavering loyalty. And an anger on her behalf that she'd never allowed herself to feel. There was a misunderstanding about my ticket, she said quietly. It's not important. With respect, Commander, I disagree. Foster stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with his rank. When a decorated officer is removed from her assigned seat due to confusion while her male counterparts face no such scrutiny, that's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination. The word hung in the air like a grenade. Patricia had followed them down the aisle, Gerald close behind. Both flight attendants had gone pale, the reality of the situation finally becoming clear. The young woman they'd dismissed, the passenger they'd deemed unworthy of first class, wasn't some budget traveler who'd gotten lucky with an upgrade. She was a naval commander who'd just returned from a classified operation, surrounded by 6 Navy SEALs who were making it very clear whose side they were on. "Gentlemen, I'm sure we can resolve this calmly," Gerald began, his earlier authority now replaced with the careful tone of someone who'd realized they'd made a catastrophic error. "If there was any confusion—" "There was no confusion," Torres interrupted, his voice hard. "My commander presented a valid boarding pass for her assigned seat. You chose to question it. You chose to move her. And I'd very much like to know why." The cabin had become a theater, every passenger transfixed by the confrontation unfolding. The businessman from 2A had appeared in the aisle, his expensive suit and whiskey suddenly irrelevant. The woman with designer bags was craning her neck to see. Even the elderly couple had abandoned their conversation about grandchildren to watch. Patricia's face had gone from pale to crimson. "We were following protocol. When there are questions about ticket validity—" "Did you question anyone else's ticket?" Chen asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Or just hers?" The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Bennett stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "I've been in the Navy for 22 years. I've served under a dozen different commanders. And I can say without hesitation that Commander Hill is one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege of working with. She's smarter than most, braver than all, and she's earned every bit of recognition she receives. What my chief is trying to say," Walsh added, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "is that you just kicked our commanding officer out of first class because you made assumptions based on her appearance. And that's not going to stand." Part 4. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the tense standoff. "This is Captain Anderson. We have a situation that needs to be resolved before we can proceed with departure. Senior crew, please report to the cockpit immediately." Gerald and Patricia exchanged worried glances before Gerald hurried toward the front of the plane. Patricia remained, her professional composure cracking at the edges. Around them, passengers whispered urgently, phones appeared as people began recording, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from curious to charged. Irene finally stood, her movements fluid despite the cramped space. "Lieutenant Torres, stand down." "That's an order." Torres turned to her, conflict clear on his face. "Sir, with respect." "I appreciate your support," Irene said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "All of you. But creating a scene isn't going to change what happened. We have a flight to catch and a debriefing to attend." "Commander, they discriminated against you," Foster said firmly. "As your liaison officer, I'm required to report this incident. Atlantic Airways needs to understand the gravity of what occurred here." Before Irene could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. The businessman from 2A had made his way to the back, his face flushed with something that looked like shame. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. I'm Richard Thornton, and I'm actually a board member of Atlantic Airways. I was sitting in first class when this young woman was questioned and removed." He turned to Irene, and she saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I didn't say anything. I sat there with my whiskey and watched them treat you like you didn't belong, and I didn't say one damn word. That makes me complicit in what happened here." The admission stunned everyone into silence. "I heard them," Thornton continued, his voice growing stronger. "The flight attendants. They looked at you and decided you couldn't possibly afford first class. They made assumptions based on your age, your clothing, your gender. And they were wrong. Spectacularly, shamefully wrong." Captain Anderson emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. He was a man in his mid-50s with silver at his temples and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. He took in the scene, the 6 Navy SEALs surrounding their commander, the crowded aisle, the watching passengers, and his crew members looking increasingly distressed. "Someone want to tell me what's happening on my aircraft?" he asked. Foster stepped forward, his military bearing evident. "Captain, I'm Lieutenant Commander William Foster, U.S. Navy. We have 7 personnel returning from a classified operation. All 7 tickets were purchased together through military channels for first-class seats. When Commander Hill boarded, your crew questioned her ticket validity and moved her to economy despite valid documentation. Her 6 male colleagues boarded later without incident and without any question of their ticket validity. Anderson's jaw tightened. He turned to Patricia. "Is this accurate?" Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, then finally nodded. There was confusion about the ticket purchase. "We were trying to verify." "Was there confusion about the other 6 tickets?" Anderson interrupted. "No, sir." "Why not?" Patricia's silence was damning. Anderson took a deep breath, then turned to Irene. "Commander Hill, on behalf of Atlantic Airways, I apologize. What happened here is unacceptable and doesn't represent the values of this airline or this crew. Your treatment was discriminatory, and there's no excuse for it." "Thank you, Captain," Irene replied, her voice steady. "Patricia, Gerald," Anderson continued, his tone shifting to command. "You're both being removed from this flight. I'll be filing a full report with HR, and there will be consequences. Commander Hill, your seat in first class is waiting for you, as it should have been from the start." The economy section erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers who'd witnessed the entire exchange clapped and cheered, several calling out support. The walk back through the aircraft was entirely different from Irene's earlier journey to economy. This time, she moved with her team surrounding her, their presence both protective and proud. Passengers who'd earlier watched her removal with judgment or indifference now offered apologetic smiles and words of support. "Thank you for your service," an elderly woman called out. "We're sorry for what happened," another passenger added. The designer bag woman from first class actually stood as they approached. "I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up earlier. You deserved better." Irene acknowledged them with quiet nods, her exhaustion now mixed with a complex swirl of emotions. Vindication felt hollow when it came after humiliation. Recognition meant less when it required her team to fight battles she'd grown tired of fighting herself. They reached first class, and Irene found her seat, 3B, exactly where it had always been meant to be. Torres took 3A beside her, while the rest of the team settled into their assigned seats. The cabin that had felt alien and unwelcoming an hour ago now felt different, transformed by the presence of people who knew her worth. Captain Anderson appeared in the cabin doorway. "Commander Hill, if I could have a moment." Irene stood and followed him to the galley, away from listening ears. "I want you to know that what happened today will be thoroughly investigated," Anderson said, his voice low and serious. "Patricia and Gerald will face disciplinary action, possibly termination. This kind of behavior has no place in our company." "I appreciate that, Captain," Irene replied. "But I'm not interested in vengeance. I'm interested in change." Anderson studied her carefully. "What do you mean?" "This wasn't an isolated incident for me," Irene explained. "I face this kind of assumption regularly. People see a young woman and make judgments about what she's capable of, where she belongs, what she deserves. Your flight attendants are symptoms of a much larger problem." "You're right," Anderson acknowledged. "So what would you suggest?" Irene paused, surprised by the question. In her experience, people rarely asked for solutions. They apologized, they promised to do better, but they seldom asked the person who'd been wronged how to actually create change. "Training," she said finally. "Real training on implicit bias. Not just checking boxes for HR, but genuine education on how assumptions affect decision-making. Your crew needs to understand that credentials don't always look the way they expect." Anderson pulled out his phone and made a note. "I'll personally ensure that happens." "Is there anything else?" "Yes," Irene said, thinking of all the times she'd stayed silent, all the times she'd made herself small. "When incidents like this occur, listen to the person affected. Not just to manage liability, but to actually understand their experience. That's how you create real change." Part 6. The flight finally departed 40 minutes late, but no one complained. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Irene settled into her seat and finally allowed herself to relax. Torres handed her a bottle of water and a small package of cookies from the first-class service, his earlier anger replaced by quiet concern. "You okay, Commander?" he asked. Irene considered the question. Was she okay? She'd been humiliated, vindicated, defended, and apologized to all in the span of an hour. Her team had stood up for her in a way that was both touching and revealing. It showed how rarely anyone did. "I will be," she answered honestly. "For what it's worth," Torres said, "what happened today was wrong. But watching you handle it with dignity and grace, that was leadership. You could have torn into them. You had every right to. But instead, you focused on solutions and change. That's why we follow you, Commander. Not because of your rank, but because of who you are." The words settled over Irene like a blanket. She'd spent so long trying to prove herself through competence, through results, through being better than everyone else at everything. But maybe true strength wasn't in being invincible. Maybe it was in being human, in acknowledging hurt while refusing to be diminished by it, in demanding change while maintaining dignity. Chen leaned over from across the aisle. "Commander, I've been thinking. We should make this public. Not for revenge, but because other people need to see what happened. They need to understand that discrimination doesn't always look like overt hostility. Sometimes it looks like confusion about a ticket. Sometimes it looks like assumptions about who belongs where." Irene started to shake her head, her instinct still to stay small, to avoid attention. But then she thought about the next young woman who would board a plane and face the same judgment. The next person whose credentials would be questioned because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what success looked like. "Maybe you're right," she said slowly. "But if we do this, we do it carefully. The goal isn't to destroy anyone's career. It's to illuminate a problem that too many people pretend doesn't exist." Bennett nodded approvingly. "That's the Commander Hill I know. Always thinking strategy, always playing the long game." The flight leveled off at cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of long-distance travel. Passengers reclined their seats, opened laptops, or closed their eyes for rest. But in first class, Irene's team was engaged in quiet conversation, processing what had happened and what it meant. Foster pulled out his tablet and began drafting an official report. "This needs to go through proper channels," he explained to Irene. "Military personnel facing discrimination while traveling on official orders is a matter for the Inspector General's office. Beyond that, Atlantic Airways needs to understand this wasn't just a customer service failure. It was a violation of your dignity in your service." Irene watched him work, appreciating his thoroughness but feeling the weight of what would follow. Once the report was filed, the incident would become official record. There would be investigations, interviews, probably media attention. Her privacy, which she guarded fiercely, would be compromised. "I need to call my mother," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "Before this becomes public, she needs to hear it from me." Torres handed her his phone, since hers had died hours ago. "Take your time, Commander." Irene moved to the galley for privacy and dialed her mother's number in Lion. It rang 3 times before the familiar voice answered, warm and concerned. "Allo? Maman, it's me," Irene said, switching to French automatically. "Irene. Finally. I've been worried sick. Where are you?" "I'm on a plane heading home. Listen, something happened today that you're going to hear about. I want you to hear it from me first." As Irene recounted the incident, she heard her mother's breathing change, becoming sharp with anger. Marguerite Hill had raised her daughter to be strong, to fight for what was right, but she'd also seen firsthand how the world treated women who refused to stay in their assigned boxes. "They had no right," Marguerite said fiercely when Irene finished. "After everything you've accomplished, everything you've sacrificed, they treated you like you didn't matter." "But that's just it, Maman," Irene replied quietly. "It wasn't about my accomplishments. They didn't know anything about me. They looked at me and made assumptions based on what they saw. A young woman in casual clothes, alone, not fitting their image of who belongs in first class. That makes it worse, not better. I know. But it's also why this matters. If it can happen to me, with all my training and rank and authority, imagine how it happens to others every day. People who don't have a team of Navy SEALs to stand up for them. Marguerite was quiet for a moment. You're going to make this public, aren't you? You're going to turn this into something bigger than just your own experience. I think I have to, Irene admitted. Not for revenge, but because silence protects the system. And the system needs to change. Then I'm proud of you, her mother said softly. But I'm also worried. Once you do this, you become more than just a commander. You become a symbol. And symbols are targets. Irene leaned against the galley wall, feeling the truth of her mother's words. She'd spent her entire career trying to be excellent at her job, to lead her team effectively, to serve with honor. She'd never wanted to be a spokesperson or an activist. But sometimes circumstances chose you rather than the other way around. I'll be careful, she promised. Be more than careful. Be strong. And remember that you don't have to carry this alone. You have your team, you have your family, and you have everyone who's been waiting for someone to speak up about what we all know is true. After they said goodbye, Irene returned to her seat feeling both lighter and heavier. Lighter because her mother's support was unwavering. Heavier because she now understood the path ahead would be complicated and possibly painful. The flight attendants who'd replaced Patricia and Gerald were notably attentive, perhaps overcompensating for their colleagues' behavior. They offered drinks, snacks, and apologetic smiles that Irene accepted with quiet grace. She wasn't interested in making them uncomfortable. They hadn't done anything wrong except work for a system that had failed. Walsh was scrolling through his phone, reading news articles. Commander, there's already chatter online. Some passengers from our flight posted about what happened. It's starting to spread. Irene leaned over to look at his screen. Sure enough, several posts featured shaky video clips of the confrontation, accompanied by captions like Navy SEALs defend their commander after she's kicked out of first class and airline faces backlash after discriminating against female military officer. The comments were multiplying by the minute. Some expressed outrage at the airline's behavior. Others questioned whether Irene had really earned her rank or if she was a diversity promotion. Still others debated whether the incident was really discrimination or just a misunderstanding. The internet was doing what it did best, taking a complex situation and reducing it to tribal battle lines. This is going to get messy, Crawford observed, reading over Walsh's shoulder. It already is, Foster said grimly. He showed them his tablet, where news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Atlantic Airways stock is already dropping. Their PR department is probably in full crisis mode. Bennett shook his head. They brought this on themselves. You don't treat people like that and expect it to stay quiet in the age of smartphones and social media. Irene felt a strange detachment as she watched her personal humiliation become public property. Part of her wanted to delete every post, to make the whole thing disappear. But another part understood that visibility was power. The incident couldn't be swept under the rug or dismissed as a misunderstanding when thousands of people were watching and demanding accountability. Her phone, now charged thanks to a power outlet in her seat, began buzzing with messages. Her brother, her friends from basic training, former colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years, everyone reaching out with support, outrage, or curiosity. The private moment of discrimination had become a public flashpoint, and Irene was at its center whether she wanted to be or not. Commander, Torres said gently, you should probably prepare a statement. The media is going to want to hear from you directly. Irene nodded, though the thought of crafting a public statement felt overwhelming. What could she say that would honor the complexity of what she felt? That would acknowledge the hurt while pushing for change? That would satisfy both her desire for justice and her reluctance to destroy careers? She opened her tablet and began drafting, choosing each word carefully. The statement needed to be clear without being vindictive, firm without being angry, personal without being self-pitying. She wrote and deleted, revised and reconsidered, until she had something that felt true. I am Commander Irene Hill, U.S. Navy. Today, while traveling on official orders, I was removed from my assigned first-class seat based on assumptions about my appearance and worthiness. This incident is not unique to me. It reflects broader patterns of bias that affect countless people every day. My hope is that by sharing this experience, we can create meaningful conversations about implicit bias and the assumptions we make about who belongs where. I am grateful to my team for their support and to Captain Anderson for his swift response. But individual apologies are not enough. We need systemic change that ensures this stops happening to others. She showed it to Foster, who read it carefully and nodded. It's good. Measured but firm. Personal but universal. When do you want to release it? After we land, Irene decided. I want to be on solid ground before this storm really hits. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a strange bubble of normalcy and tension. Irene tried to rest, but her mind kept returning to the incident, analyzing it from every angle. She thought about Patricia and Gerald, wondering what had motivated their actions. Was it conscious prejudice or unconscious bias? Did they genuinely believe they were following protocol, or had they known on some level that they were making assumptions based on stereotypes? She thought about the passengers who'd watched her removal without speaking up, and about Richard Thornton who'd had the courage to admit his complicity. How many people witnessed injustice every day and remained silent? How many convinced themselves it wasn't their problem or that they'd misunderstood what was happening? And she thought about her team, these 6 men who'd served with her through dangerous operations and who'd stood up for her without hesitation. Their defense had been immediate and unequivocal because they knew her worth from experience. They'd seen her lead under pressure, make impossible decisions, and bring everyone home safely. They didn't need to question whether she belonged because they'd witnessed her earning her place over and over again. But the world didn't work that way. Most people would never see her in action, would never know about the missions she'd led or the lives she'd saved. They would only see the surface, a young woman who didn't match their expectations. And that was the problem. Worthiness shouldn't have to be proven over and over to strangers who'd made up their minds based on a glance. Chin broke into her thoughts. Commander, I've been thinking about what you said to Captain Anderson. About training and systemic change. Do you really think that's possible? Can you train away bias? Irene considered the question carefully. I don't know if you can eliminate it entirely. Bias is human. We all make quick judgments based on pattern recognition and past experience. But you can become aware of it. You can learn to question your assumptions and check your first impressions against reality. That's what good training does. It doesn't make you perfect, but it makes you conscious of your imperfections. The military does this better than most places, Bennett added. Not perfectly, God knows. But we're forced to confront bias because lives depend on it. You can't afford to dismiss someone's capabilities based on gender or appearance when you're in a firefight together. The civilian world doesn't have that same forcing function. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. So incidents like this become the forcing function. They make people confront bias they'd rather ignore. That's the hope, Irene agreed. But it only works if people are willing to learn rather than just defend themselves. That's the hard part. The captain announced their initial descent into Washington, D.C., and passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. Irene looked out the window at the city spread below, thinking about what waited for her on the ground. The debriefing would be routine, but everything after that would be unprecedented territory. Foster leaned across the aisle. Commander, I've been coordinating with the base. They're aware of the situation and prepared to provide support. There will probably be media at the airport, so we'll have security escort you through if needed. Media already? Irene asked, surprised despite herself. The story's gone viral, Walsh confirmed, showing her his phone again. It's trending on multiple platforms. Atlantic Airways has issued a statement, though it's pretty generic corporate speak about taking the matter seriously and investigating thoroughly. The plane touched down smoothly, but as they taxied toward the gate, Irene could see the unusual activity on the tarmac. News vans, additional security personnel, and a small crowd that had gathered despite airport restrictions. The incident that had started as a private humiliation had transformed into a public phenomenon, and there was no going back to anonymity now. "Looks like we're getting the full reception," Crawford observed dryly. Captain Anderson's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Washington Dulles International Airport. Before we begin deplaning, I want to personally thank Commander Hill and her team for their service to our country. What happened at the beginning of this flight was unacceptable, and Atlantic Airways is committed to ensuring it never happens again. Commander, on behalf of everyone on this crew, thank you for your grace and your leadership." The cabin erupted in applause, passengers standing to show their respect. Irene felt her face flush as she acknowledged them with a small wave. This kind of public recognition was everything she'd spent her career avoiding, yet here it was, unavoidable and overwhelming. As first-class passengers, they were among the first to deplane. Irene shouldered her duffel bag and walked up the jetway, her team forming a protective formation around her without anyone needing to give the order. They'd worked together long enough that such things happened instinctively. The terminal was chaos. Airport security had cordoned off an area, but beyond the barriers, reporters with cameras jostled for position. Passengers from other flights stopped to watch, their phones out and recording. Irene spotted military personnel in uniform standing at attention, a show of solidarity that made her throat tight. A Navy public affairs officer approached quickly, his expression professionally neutral. "Commander Hill, I'm Lieutenant Kevin Rogers. I've been assigned to help you navigate this situation. We have a car waiting to take you to the base, and security will escort you through the terminal." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Irene replied, grateful for the structure and support. As they moved through the terminal, reporters called out questions. "Commander Hill, how does it feel to be vindicated? Will you be pressing charges against Atlantic Airways? Do you think this incident represents broader problems with discrimination in civilian spaces?" Irene kept walking, her training in handling media attention from classified operations serving her well. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful response, that not every question deserved an answer. But then she heard a voice that cut through the noise. "Commander Hill, what would you say to other women who face similar discrimination but don't have a team of SEALs to defend them?" Irene stopped. That was the question that mattered, the one that got to the heart of why this incident was bigger than just her personal experience. She turned to face the reporter, a young woman with earnest eyes and a recording device held at the ready. "I'd say that your worth isn't determined by who's willing to stand up for you," Irene said clearly, her voice carrying through the terminal. "Your worth is inherent. But I'd also say that we all have a responsibility to stand up for each other. The passengers on that flight who watched me being removed and said nothing, they had power they chose not to use. The next time you see someone being treated unfairly, remember that your voice matters. Your witness matters. Don't wait for someone else to speak up." The military car wound through Washington traffic toward the naval base, and Irene finally had a moment of relative quiet. Her team had been directed to a separate debriefing location, leaving her alone with Lieutenant Rogers and her thoughts. The city looked the same as always, monuments gleaming white in the afternoon sun, government buildings standing stolid and unmoved, but Irene felt fundamentally changed. "Commander, I need to prepare you for what's waiting," Rogers said, pulling up news feeds on his tablet. "The story has exploded beyond anything we anticipated. Atlantic Airways stock dropped 12%. The CEO issued a personal apology an hour ago. And there are calls for congressional hearings on discrimination in the airline industry." Irene stared at the headlines scrolling past. "All of this from one incident?" "It's not just one incident," Rogers replied. "It's the incident that finally made people pay attention. There are hundreds of comments from people sharing similar experiences. Women of color talking about being questioned in business class. Young professionals assumed to be lost when they enter executive spaces. Your story gave permission for others to share theirs." The weight of that responsibility settled on Irene's shoulders. She'd become, as her mother predicted, more than just a commander. She was now a catalyst, whether she'd chosen that role or not. At the base, Admiral Patricia Summers was waiting in her office. Summers was a legend, the first woman to command a carrier strike group, a mentor to countless female officers, and someone who'd fought her own battles against discrimination throughout her career. She stood as Irene entered, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Commander Hill," Summers said, gesturing to a chair. "Quite a day you've had." "Yes, ma'am," Irene replied, sitting at attention despite her exhaustion. Summers studied her for a long moment. "I've read the preliminary reports. What happened on that aircraft was discrimination, plain and simple. But I need to know, how are you handling this?" The question surprised Irene with its directness. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm still processing. Part of me wants to forget it happened. But another part understands that this is bigger than my personal discomfort. That's the burden of being first," Summers said quietly. "Or in your case, being one of the few. Every time something like this happens to you, it's not just about you. It becomes about every woman who'll come after you. Every person who doesn't fit the traditional mold of what leadership looks like. That doesn't seem fair, ma'am. It's not fair. It's exhausting and frustrating and sometimes infuriating. But it's also necessary. Change doesn't happen because people suddenly become enlightened. It happens because someone stands up and forces the conversation, even when they'd rather not." Irene thought about her statement, still waiting to be released. "I've drafted something. A public response." Summers held out her hand, and Irene passed over her tablet. The Admiral read carefully, her expression thoughtful. When she finished, she nodded. "This is good. Measured but clear. It addresses the incident without making it solely about you. But Irene," she used her first name deliberately, "once you release this, your life changes. You'll be invited to speak at conferences. Media will want interviews. Some people will see you as a hero, others as a troublemaker. Are you ready for that?" Irene considered the question honestly. Was she ready? No. But readiness wasn't the point. The point was necessity. "I don't think anyone's ever really ready for their private pain to become public discourse," she said slowly. "But I keep thinking about Patricia, the flight attendant. She didn't wake up that morning planning to discriminate. She probably thinks of herself as a good person. But she made assumptions based on unconscious bias, and those assumptions had real consequences. If we don't talk about that, if we don't examine how it happens, then nothing changes." Summers smiled, and there was something fierce in it. "That's exactly the right answer. Release your statement, Commander. Tell your truth. And know that you have the full support of this command." 3 months later, Irene stood at a podium in a hotel conference room, addressing an audience of airline industry executives, human resources professionals, and diversity trainers. Atlantic Airways had invited her to speak at their company-wide training initiative, part of the sweeping changes implemented after the incident. Patricia and Gerald had been terminated, but more importantly, the entire company was undergoing a transformation in how they approached unconscious bias. "The day I was removed from first class, I had a choice," Irene told the assembled crowd. "I could have stayed silent, accepted the apology, and moved on with my life. Many people do exactly that because fighting is exhausting and the outcome is uncertain. But silence protects the system that created the problem in the first place." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about discrimination in travel. "Since my story became public, over 2,000 people have shared similar experiences. 2,000 incidents of being questioned, moved, or treated as if they didn't belong, all because they didn't match someone's narrow expectations. This isn't about bad individuals. It's about systems that allow bias to operate unchecked." Richard Thornton sat in the front row, the board member who'd admitted his complicity. He'd become an unexpected ally, using his position to push for substantive change within the company. Beside him sat Captain Anderson, who'd volunteered to be part of the training program, sharing his perspective on what he'd witnessed and how it changed his understanding of discrimination. After her presentation, a young woman approached Irene during the break. She wore an Atlantic Airways uniform and couldn't have been more than 25. "Commander Hill," I wanted to thank you. I'm a new flight attendant, and your story changed our entire training program. We now spend 2 full days on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. It's made me think differently about assumptions I didn't even know I was making. That's exactly what needs to happen, Irene replied warmly. Not just in airlines, but everywhere. We all carry biases. The question is whether we're willing to examine them and change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Torres. Commander, mission briefing at 1400 tomorrow. New operation in the North Sea. Hope your speaking tour hasn't made you soft. Irene smiled. Despite everything that had happened, despite becoming a public figure and an advocate for change, she was still first and foremost a naval officer. Her team was preparing for another mission, and she would lead them as she always had, with competence, courage, and the determination to bring everyone home safely. The incident on Flight 247 hadn't defined her, but it had expanded her understanding of leadership. True leadership wasn't just about tactical decisions and mission success. It was also about using your platform to create change, about speaking up when silence would be easier, about transforming personal pain into collective progress. As Irene packed up her materials and prepared to leave the conference, she thought about that morning 3 months ago when she'd stood in the Frankfurt Airport, exhausted and invisible, just trying to get home. She'd been the same person then as she was now, skilled, dedicated, worthy of respect. The only difference was that now, more people knew it. But the real victory wasn't in the recognition. It was in the system changes, the training programs, the policy revisions, the conversations happening in boardrooms and break rooms about who belongs where and why. It was in the young flight attendant who'd thanked her for changing the training. It was in the thousands of comments from people who'd felt seen and validated by her story. Irene walked out into the afternoon sunshine, her duffel bag over her shoulder, ready for whatever came next. She'd learned that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought on classified operations in hostile territory. Sometimes they were fought in airplane cabins and conference rooms, in statements released to the press and conversations that challenged comfortable assumptions. She'd been kicked out of first class, but she'd stood back up. And in doing so, she'd helped others stand up too. That was leadership. That was service. That was exactly what she'd signed up for, even if she hadn't known it at the time. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. Saw your speech online. Your father would have been so proud. I know I am. Come home soon, ma chérie. Irene smiled, typed a quick response, and headed toward her car. Tomorrow she'd be back in uniform, planning operations and leading her team. But today, she'd used her voice to create change. Both were equally important. Both were part of serving something larger than herself. The sun was setting over Washington, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Irene paused for just a moment to appreciate it, to feel the warmth on her face, to acknowledge how far she'd come. Then she got in her car and drove toward whatever came next, ready as always to prove that belonging isn't given, it's claimed, defended, and shared with everyone who comes after. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.